Well, thank you, Dick, and thank you, Kim, for having me here, and thank all of you for spending this afternoon with me. I have to find out how you knew about that temple history. Maybe did I tell you that along the way at some point?
It's in a magazine.
Ah, okay. Well, it's absolutely true. I stumbled into sociology, and it couldn't have found a better home. Very rewarding career. The book, The Long Shadow, is the culmination of a 30-year journey. Actually, it was 25 years in the field as empirical research study. We started back in 1982, my colleagues and I. We selected a representative random sample of children who were beginning first grade that year in 20 Baltimore City public schools scattered throughout the city. And we stayed at it. we watched them grow up as they moved through the educational system, first grade through 12th, and then for a decade after. It was really quite a remarkable journey. I'd hazard to guess that there is not a comparable collaboration in the history of sociology. Doris and I worked well together over those many years. Lasted longer than most marriages nowadays, and there was less friction involved in it, I can tell you that. Sadly, Doris passed away just before the book went to press, but she knew it was done, and she felt good about what we had accomplished, and Linda and I were grateful for that. So the book was published in the summer of 2014, and as probably everybody in this room recognizes, Baltimore suffered a traumatic, wrenching experience last April. So we're now at roughly the one-year anniversary of the Freddie Gray death, and then the outburst that ensued. The book is not about Freddie Gray. It obviously was written before that happened. But I've come to reflect on what we did and through the lens of the Freddie Gray experience, and I think there are important lessons to be learned about the conditions that lay the groundwork for what we saw in Baltimore that year. And what I would like to do in light of that is to kind of frame it around the Freddie Gray story and what lessons we have to learn about the conditions, the backdrop conditions. And so The Long Shadow, we're very proud of the title and of the imagery, and actually your poster did a good job of approximating it as well. The connotation of the long shadow is that family circumstances early in life cast a long shadow. That is, the conditions of family life that you experience when you're growing up has the effect of moving different kinds of children across different life trajectories. And we were particularly interested in this work in trying to understand the differences across social lines, African American white children, working class, middle class children, and boys and girls, and later on, young men and young women. Our coverage, the empirics of it, extend a decade after what would be on-time high school graduation into age 28, 29. And so the project encompasses a goodly span of the developmental life course from 6 years old, cute and cuddly little children, into young adulthood, with many points of observation along the way. So, family life casts a long shadow. That's the imagery. I'm going to start at the very end of the book. This is how we lead off chapter 9. Now, we did this before Freddie Gray, but it has, I think, particular resonance in light of Freddie Gray. So, in our after high school interviews, we asked our study participants to reflect back on their lives and how they feel about where they are today and what it means to be successful. And these are a couple representative replies. They're not cherry-picked. They capture fairly well the sentiment that we heard. So Ken, and these are pseudonyms, obviously, Ken told us, I think I'm successful now because I'm happy, I don't have a lot of money, I live paycheck to paycheck, but I'm happy because I come home every day to the person I want to be with, I pick up the phone, my parents are still there if I need to talk with them or if I want to talk with them. I'm happy, I'm comfortable. That's what we heard from Ken. From Dylan, we heard, I think my parents are successful. They're not rich or anything, but they were successful as far as raising all those children, And even though we did some things, nobody did anything real major. And we all still alive. All of us are still alive. Those are very substantial standards of success, but it's not the account that you likely would hear from children who grew up in the wealthier suburbs surrounding Baltimore. There's no fancy home in the picture, there's no fancy car, there's no high-paying job. Most of the young people that we worked with over those years wanted those things also, but these issues, these criteria of success come close to home, and they can't be taken for granted given the circumstances under which these children came of age. A study that was published not too long ago documents a 20-year difference in life expectancy across Baltimore's wealthiest and poorest neighborhoods. 26-year difference in life expectancy. 86 years on the one hand, 66 on the other. That's shocking. I mean, it ought to be shocking. It shocked me when I first read it. It won't surprise that the neighborhoods with the lowest life expectancy are the low-income African-American neighborhoods, 26 years. To be happy, to be comfortable, to be still alive. Our research procedures in this project were very successful, and I say that not to brag, it's an objective statement of fact. We managed to relocate and re-interview 80% of the original group on 2 occasions after high school, at age 22, 23, and age 28, 29. 80% of the original group. This is a low-income population, highly mobile, not easy to track, I promise you. We felt really good about that. Started with 790. We conducted 667 interviews in what we call our mature adult survey. That's not particularly original labeling, but it serves the purpose. It was our last after high school contact. So we were unable to conduct 123 interviews. Now, those are missed opportunities. What we discovered along the way when we reached out using the contact information we had in our big database was that there were 26 known deceased among this group. That's known deceased. So over 20% of the interviews that we were not able to conduct in the mature adult survey, we couldn't do because these young people were no longer with us. Over 20%. And it's probably more than that because there were some that we could not find anything about. So to be happy, to be comfortable, to be still alive, these are substantial values. And we started the last chapter with them to make that point, that as academic researchers and sociologists of education, we try to understand how prospects for upward mobility through the educational system and in other means work for children of different backgrounds. And so we're interested in the book in trying to understand how far young people go through school and what kinds of jobs they get after they complete their education and what their salaries and earnings are in those jobs. And those are substantial criteria for success also. But we wanted to make the point that our standards are not necessarily those standards, and that the people we study deserve to be respected, and we tried to respect them by kind of sharing their perspective with our readership at the very outset. And I think in light of the Freddie Gray incident, these quotes and these kind of sense of priorities in terms of life circumstances have a special resonance. Here's another quote. This is from Chip, African-American. He told us about the experience of having his brother gunned down in a drug deal that went bad when thugs invaded his home. And Chip told us it was a month or 2 months that I would try to go to school, but I would leave because if I felt I was like I had to cry, I would leave. I wouldn't cry in front of nobody. And that's a hurting feeling when you lose somebody that close. That's an understatement, right? That's a hurting feeling for sure. We're just beginning to learn the consequences for children's academic performance of exposure to traumatic life events. This is traumatic. Again, I don't want to denigrate any segment of the population. Middle-class families suffer stress and strains as well. But this is stress. This is strain. And it's not what you would expect to encounter, again, in a wealthier suburban community. Chip was haunted by this experience. And it's understandable that he would be. We introduced this quote in the book in the context of describing how we measure stressful life experiences in our survey approach, which is very different from this. But it's the industry standard. We would, in the early years, we would ask the parents about this, and then as the children got older, we would ask the children themselves. So it was a checklist of 15 items. During the last 24 months, did you experience a serious illness? Did you experience a loss of a job? Was there a divorce in your family? And you go through the whole list, And then for the number of ones that when they say yes, then you tally those up, and that's the average level of stress exposure over a year's time. Turns out that's a terribly effective empirical device for ranking families and for seeing differences. But it's a very surface account. I mean, this is the reality of stress in the kinds of conditions that too many of our young people grow up. So the book is about opportunities to move up in life when you start out low. It's a study of intergenerational mobility, origins to destinations and life course perspective. It just rolls off the tongue, at least my tongue. The agenda is not original with us, and we have in the book this quote from Joseph Stiglitz. He's a Nobel laureate economist, so has credibility that maybe an academic sociologist doesn't. And in this piece that was published in the New York Times Opinionator, he's got a book that focuses on this research of his. He characterizes equal opportunity in the United States as a national myth, a national myth. And he goes on to say, life prospects of an American are more dependent on the income and education of his parents than in almost any other advanced industrial country. That's very sobering. His research was to compare across nation states, the United States versus other industrialized countries, to see what the patterns of upward mobility are across generations. We like to think that we are the land of opportunity, that there's an American exceptionalism. It's almost a conceit that through the dint of hard work, if you work hard, you play by the rules, you do what you're supposed to do, you do what your parents tell you to do, you do what your teachers tell you to do, and everything will be right in the world. That is, the opportunities to move up are boundless and endless. Aspirationally, I think most of us would agree that we would like to think that we live in that world, but the reality of the here and now is that we fall far short of that aspiration. And so Stiglitz's perspective is comparative, experience in the United States against other industrialized countries. Our agenda is precisely the same, but it's inward looking. It looks within Baltimore, Maryland, to try to understand the prospects, life prospects of different children, different kinds of children, depending as a function of what their conditions experienced early in life were. So that's what we're doing in The Long Shadow. We have an orienting imagery. This picture is not in the book, but we certainly refer to Richard Jesser, and it helps inform our thinking and the work that we present. It's Richard Jesser's perspective on social development across the time frame. This is from an article that appeared in the American Psychologist in 1993. This is the exact time frame of our research, starting in pre-adolescence, 6 years old, first graders, going through adolescence into young adulthood. Social development moves over time. It's an ongoing process. And what Jesser says is that young people in particular, in terms of their educational development and their social development, are first and foremost impacted by the experiences in three institutional settings. These three institutional, the institutional settings that they experience up close and personal, day in and day out. Family, neighborhood, and school. Family, neighborhood, and school. And our book tries to comprehend the importance of family, neighborhood, and school and the evolving life patterns of these young people that we've studied. And I'll say a bit about that as we move forward. But Jesser also points out that those three institutional settings are themselves embedded in a larger sociocultural context. Some of you in the room may be familiar with the name Yuri Bronfenbrenner. It's very social ecological, but without the obscure language. This is the same idea. So the patterns of personal development are situated historically and in time and space. And that's certainly true of the work that we did in the book In the Long Shadow. The larger socio-historical context is deindustrializing Baltimore over the last 2 decades of the 20th century into the first decade of the 21st. And that backdrop, which I'll say a bit about momentarily, plays a very large role in determining the broad contours of opportunities that are available to young people growing up in Baltimore. I want to return, though, to the overlapping spheres of influence, because that's the key insight here. Not that you can identify family, neighborhood, and school. I think any of us could have done that if we just gave it a moment's thought. The key is the overlap. That you have it's a Venn diagram, with the overlap. And the overlap is not necessarily set in stone. They can, the institutional press or pressures that children encounter in these settings can be aligned so that they move children in the same direction, or they can be weakly aligned so that they provide opportunities to move in different directions. So that is the key insight from Jesser. And it comes down to a very simple realization that sadly applies to too many of the young people in our study. Family, neighborhood, and school as social contexts that frame children's development, for our perspective, they're all expressions of family background. When we think about family influence, the tendency is to think about conditions at the interior of family life. What are the family's material resources that they can bring to bear on their children's academic development and social development? Their investment in children's schooling. Can they buy all the educational toys that we know are important to moving kids ahead? So that's at the interior of family life. But families also decide what neighborhood they're going to live in, and in deciding the neighborhood that you're going to live in, you also decide what school your child's going to attend. So the long shadow expresses itself in these various ways, not just in the narrow realm of the interior of family life. What we find, none too surprising, I'm sorry to say, is that many of Baltimore's poor children also live in high poverty neighborhoods and also attend schools that are burdened by concentrated poverty. That is, they enroll children substantially like themselves because they come from the same neighborhoods. Family poverty, neighborhood poverty, school poverty. Each one of those is understood to be a risk factor separately from the other two, but when they're aligned in your life, you have a profile that poses daunting challenges in terms of breaking out and moving up. Poor families, poor neighborhoods, poor schools. Young people who experience those three institutional settings in conjunction are triply disadvantaged. It's not just disadvantaged in that way or in that way, they're disadvantaged in all those ways. And that poses challenges for them. And it should trouble those of us who care about them. The socio-cultural background of the book is the deindustrialized Baltimore. It's easy to forget that in order for a city like Baltimore, Middle Atlantic states, or the Rust Belt cities of the Midwest to deindustrialize, they first had to industrialize. Yeah? There was a moment in history when Baltimore had a vibrant industrial economy. In fact, it was the economic powerhouse of the Middle Atlantic states, 1950s extending into the 1960s. Here's the iconic image of Baltimore's industrial prowess. That was the Bethlehem Steel plant. During the World War II mobilization, Beth Steel was the largest steel mill in the world, with 35,000 employees. Over the years since, it went through several successive bankruptcies, and last year it is broken up and sold off as scrap metal. Those 35,000 jobs don't exist any longer. The historians of the day, the labor historians, characterize this moment in time as generating a blue-collar elite. That is, where a young man, typically, without the benefit of college and often without a high school degree, could get a good-paying job, steady work, with union protections that would allow him to support a family on a single earner income at a very respectable, comfortable level in working-class neighborhoods that look a lot like this. Okay, blue-collar elite. I want to make one point, and I'll return to it later. While the collars were blue, the beneficiaries were substantially white back in the 50s and 60s. African Americans were a presence in the steel mills, on the docks, in the auto assembly plants, in the aircraft assembly plants that were the backbone of Baltimore's vibrant industrial economy. But the African Americans were substantially relegated to low-wage, low-skilled, dirty work. They were not part of the blue-collar elite. Now, the important point there is that there is a legacy to that plays forward. Okay? 50s and 60s, Baltimore's economy was booming. Our children were first graders in 1982. They were born in 1977. their parents and certainly their grandparents lived through this economy. Some of them benefited from it, others were on the outside of it. And we will see that history repeat itself in the experiences of our young people grown up. So file that away. That was Baltimore then. Here's what too much of Baltimore looks like today. I say too much. I want to be careful not to paint with too broad a brush. My wife and I live in downtown Baltimore, and I can't imagine a better quality of life. You can live very well, very happily in Baltimore if you're fortunate enough to be able to take advantage of the best that Baltimore has to offer. But too many local people aren't that fortunate. So the Annie Casey Foundation, which is a large national foundation focused on child welfare and headquartered in Baltimore, a few years ago issued a report which captured the transformation of Baltimore City over precisely this period of time. And here's what they have to say about it. It is not a pretty picture. They characterize it as a perfect storm of crippling trends and tragic events: the dramatic loss of manufacturing jobs and tax base, the ruinous riots in 1967 and 68, the exodus of first white, then African American middle-class families, the sequential epidemics of heroin, crack cocaine, and HIV, the intensified crime and gang activity that fed and feasted off the drug trade, and the activities of slumlords, property flippers, and predatory lenders. The end result has been an ever-deepening cycle of disinvestment and decline. That's how the Casey Foundation was able to characterize this period of time, by kind of looking down from on high. Here's what we heard when we asked our study participants to reflect back on their experiences growing up in their neighborhoods where they lived. Let me just share with you the middle one from Sona. Where I lived is more or less like, I guess you'd say, family-oriented, because everybody knew everybody. When you hear everybody talking about how someone could spank you, whether they were family or not, well, that's what it was like on the block. And maybe one or two parents was watching us and stuff. And then after a while, the neighborhood started going down. Basically, the kids were getting badder and badder, and the people you thought was really nice was changing. You know what I mean? Well, in light of what the Casey Foundation had to say about kind of the macro trends, I think we do know what Sona meant. One of the things that I've come to appreciate through my work on this project, and it was a 25, 30-year labor of love, is that there's a lot of intuitive sociology out there. That is, these young people aren't describing their life experience using the same language terminology that I would use as an academic sociologist, but they're seeing the same thing, and it's registering with them, and they understand its importance. So how I would describe the world that Sona saw changing in front of her was a decline of social capital at the neighborhood level, a loss of social cohesion. Parents looking after parents, neighbors' children. Low-income communities can be strong communities. They can be cohesive communities. They can be a good springboard for what follows, if they are solidarity, if they are characterized by strong social cohesion and are solid and are so socially cohesive. I was lost the word there. A distressed community is one where they don't have those advantages of strength of character and togetherness. And what Sona is describing is a decline of community that was unfolding right before her eyes. So that's the backdrop. That's the changing character of Baltimore City over this period of time as these young people were coming of age. Remember, first graders in 1982, young adults in 2005, 2006, 25 years later. The book sketches two success narratives. We thought it was going to be about the educational system because that's what my colleagues and I have been studying for all those years. And it is substantially about the educational system that is doing well in school as the springboard for upward mobility. But it turns out, through a process of discovery, if you will, that there was a second success narrative that turned out to be very prominent in the life experiences of these young people. And once we saw it, we've had an obligation to pursue it and to try to understand what was driving the second success narrative. So I'll say a bit about both of them. The first success narrative is the educational system, which is, as middle-class parents, this is what we tell our kids, right? You Focus in on your studies, do well at school, and good things will follow. A lot of our young people tried to heed that advice and listen to their parents and apply themselves at school, but it wasn't always the case that good things followed. So when we, at our last interview cycle, when we talked to all these young, 80% of the original group, we monitored their educational progress over the years, how far had they gone through school, what degrees they had, those sorts of things. 45% of the middle class, of the children of middle class families growing up had a baccalaureate degree or beyond. So there were a half dozen doctoral degrees in the mix and at least 12 to 15 master's degrees. So 45% had a bachelor's degree or beyond. Now, keep in mind that these are all families whose children began school in Baltimore City public schools. So these are not the creme de la creme, the wealthiest families in the Baltimore area. These are solid middle class families. And they were solid middle class families, absolutely. 45%. They were about a fourth of the panel, the way we classify families. Half the panel was low income growing up, half. And when we monitored their educational success and progress as young adults, only 4% had completed a bachelor's degree. 4%. That's a tenfold difference in college completion across social lines. Again, it's shocking. We expected to see differences. We didn't expect to see them of that magnitude. So not many of Baltimore's poor children are getting ahead in life today by virtue of having advanced academic credentials. Now, Baltimore City and the surrounding county has a very extensive community college system. You're probably familiar with that, 2-year college academic degrees. If you add in 2-year college degrees into the mix, the 4% goes up to 5.5%. Okay. Again, it's a difference that really doesn't make much of a difference. There are a lot of considerations that go into play in understanding why these young people are moving across such different trajectories of school academic success. And I'll mention a couple of them as we move on. But I wanted to also, just to make sure that I have the time to I want to hit the highlights, I want to mention this, the second success narrative and how it presents itself in our evidence, and then set us off on this process of discovery. In our young adult survey and our mature adult survey, that is our 2 after high school surveys, we also asked about employment experience and what kind of job you hold, how long you've had it, what your salary is, and all those kinds of things. And what we found is that there was a really dramatic difference in the experiences of white men of working class background. Now, I have to say something here as a little sidebar, because when people talk about, when you say urban disadvantage, which is what this book is about, I hazard a guess that almost everyone thinks people of color, poor African Americans growing up in places like Baltimore, or Hispanic Latinos in some places. It turns out that 40% of our low-income panel is white. There are pockets of white poverty in Baltimore and in other cities like Baltimore that look interchangeable with poor black neighborhoods. But white poverty is off the radar when it comes to research on the urban poor. I challenge you to find studies out there that look intensively at the experience of poor whites growing up in urban centers. It's just not there. We are fortunate, because of the way we do our sample, to have good coverage of these young people and of their families, and the comparisons across lines of poor whites and poor African Americans growing up in very similar circumstances as children is very illuminating. And here's where that comparison took us. When we asked about their employment at age 28, 29, at the time of the mature adult survey, 45%, this is really quite striking, it's startling actually, 45% of the white men of working class background were employed in the remnants of Baltimore's industrial and construction crafts and trades, almost half, 45%. These are jobs like auto mechanics, welders, plumbers, electricians. The jobs that we were told disappeared with deindustrialization. Well, they haven't disappeared altogether. They're greatly diminished. But those jobs are still out there. Right across the street from where my wife and I live, they're building a 22-story office tower. There's a lot of construction jobs that are in that kind of work. So there are big projects. Last year, they had a record number of cargo container ships come up to the Baltimore harbor to be unloaded. There's still jobs out there. And even when you go beyond the big employers and the big projects, you've got an army of small jobbers. If you need your oil changed in your car, you've got auto mechanics to take to. If you need the electricity upgraded in your home, you've got a guy who can come in and do that for you. So there's still a sector of the economy that provides space for that kind of work. And it turns out it's almost the exclusive province of white men of working class background. African American men at age 28, 29 who were employed in that sector, they're only 15%. So 45%, 15%. It's not quite the same tenfold difference as with baccalaureate degree completion, but that's a big gap, 45 and 15%. But even more revealing is that the white men who were working in that sector of the economy were earning twice what the African American men were earning. So I said earlier, file away the booming industrial economy where African Americans were a presence, but they were relegated to low-wage, low-skilled, dirty work. That's still substantially the case today in Baltimore's blue-collar economy. Where African Americans do penetrate this sector of the economy, they're still relegated to low-wage, low-skilled, dirty work. They're construction laborers. They're not skilled welders or stonemasons doing that kind of work. We think we understand where that advantage comes from through our questioning along the way, and we'll try to get to it. First, upward mobility. I'm going to be giving a presentation tomorrow on our work on summer learning loss. I don't know if any people in the room are kind of familiar with that idea, but if you've encountered the expression summer slide at some point, well, we introduced that to the literature. I feel pride of ownership because that's been a very impactful concept. So that work is relevant here. But what we find is that poor children on average, now again, there are exceptions to every rule, but the rules are very powerful and very binding. But you don't want to paint with too broad a brush. But poor children start out behind academically. Their test scores are lower than the non-poor children's test scores. Their grades are lower. They're more likely to repeat first grade than the non-poor. When they get to middle grades, they're more likely to be assigned to low-level remedial classes, and not the gifted in talent and advanced classes. They're much more likely to drop out of high school, and they're much less likely to continue on to college. So you see this pattern of middle-class advantage in terms of the academic experience that is apparent right out of the gate in first grade, and the differences just increase over time. It's the exploding achievement gap. It manifests itself in all sorts of ways within the educational system. And the book, The Long Shadow, documents that. You can just see it in all its, I don't want to say glory, but you see it in all its horrible detail. So there is that. Poor children and their parents want to do well in school. They want to be able to take advantage of the opportunities that doing well in school provides, and many of them try. The last time we spoke to this group, 85% of the entire panel said that they intended to continue in education. This is at age 28. Okay, that includes same percentage for the youngsters who did not even have a high school degree at that age, not even a GED. We call them our permanent high school dropouts. At age 28, they didn't even have a GED. They say they want to continue in school. So these are not stupid people. They understand the importance of getting a good academic grounding in order to move ahead in life. Often they made bad decisions, and you can't roll back the clock. But about a third of them started down the college path. So they actually voted with their feet. They wanted to get a college degree, right? And but only 4% succeeded. So a little-known reality of life in America is that levels of college dropout nowadays are vastly higher than levels of high school dropout. You hear what I said? Levels of college dropout are vastly higher than our levels of high school dropout. But we don't seem to perceive it as the same kind of social problem that high school dropout is perceived. Many young people start down the college path only to be frustrated and not be able to see it through to completion. These are highly motivated kids. Many of them, I'm convinced, have the ability to succeed, and yet they encounter practical challenges along the way that they cannot overcome. And here's one. This is Kim. Kim had a baby when she was in high school, not unusual. But what is unusual is that she finished school on time and she graduated near the top of her class. She credits the father of her baby for helping make that happen. After high school, she started down the college path. She enrolled in a community college, and she did it for a while, and then she had to stop out. Her daughter needed her. There were financial issues, so she had to buy herself some time. She got a job in a law firm and was able to take advantage of employee benefits to help cover tuition, so she re-enrolled. And it's the same story. After a bit of time, she pulled out again because she felt her daughter was being neglected and her daughter needed her attention. So the short of it is 3 enrollment spells, highly motivated, very capable young woman, age 28. After 3 attempts at community college, she had 35 earned credits. When we last talked to Kim at age 28, she wanted to get a doctoral degree, she said, but she expected only to make it as far as the baccalaureate. That's, at age 28, 35 earned credits. That's probably still something of a stretch. We don't know. But here's what Kim had to say in terms of her parenting responsibilities. Just sometimes I get frustrated because when I want something, I want it now, you know. And there's a lot of things that stand in my way. I don't mean the way that she stands in my way, this referring to her daughter, but she has to come first, you know. I'm sure if I didn't have her, I probably would be in law school right now. So that's a counterfactual. I mean, she had her. She didn't not have her. But there are a lot of Kims out there who really struggle mightily to try to get ahead in life and do the things that we tell them that they ought to do, who encounter daunting obstacles along the way and can't see it through. They need our help. They're working hard at it. And I am of the opinion that the Kims of the world vastly outnumber the kids who are struggling academically and can't make it because they don't have the academic wherewithal. So we heard many accounts like Kim's. We heard stories about having to provide help to your children, which is the obvious, all of us understand that, but also taking care of needy parents. Problem encounters with the law that throw up interference. So mass incarceration is a very, very big deal for the kinds of young people that we were studying. There's just a lot of practical obstacles, everyday life, that set up interference. And we heard the stories. Now let me switch. I want to move on. Everybody understands, I think, that academic development is a long-term process that plays out over time. You know, you start first grade and you're doing what you do, and then you get through middle grades and high school, and then you move on. Vocational development is also a long-term process that plays out over time, but we don't usually think of it in the same light. When we talk to these young men, African American and white, about their work experience along the way, at age 28, this is what we saw. 45% of white men of working class background were employed in the industrial crafts and trades. 15% of African Americans. The whites were making roughly twice what the African Americans were earning. So we've heard that story, but that's the end of the story, not the beginning of the story. When we were talking to them in middle grades and high school, we asked the same kinds of questions. What kind of part-time work were you doing after school or during the summer? And here's what we found. The white men of working class background, while in high school, 21% of them were employed in the industrial crafts and trades, skilled crafts and trades. Not a single young African American. 0. Now, here's the point. These young white guys were not electricians and auto mechanics and welders and stonemasons. No, they weren't doing that kind of stuff. But they were helping out. They were helping an older brother, they were helping a father, they were helping a neighbor across the street, they were helping someone in the church, kind of working in that sector of the economy. And by having access to that kind of opportunity, they were building up a skill set, they were establishing relationships that could pay off later and open doors for them down the road. The African American guys, growing up in very similar circumstances, they didn't have that. There was no one that could help them get established in that sector of the economy. So that's in high school. At age 22, our young adult survey, it was the 30%, 8%, and then 45 to 15%. It's a different kind of achievement gap across social lines. You know, it's not a test score gap, but it's an experience and opportunity gap. And it takes you to the very same place, where certain kinds of young people are disadvantaged and other kinds of young people are advantaged. And it is a very big deal. I tell you, if you're not going to be able to get on in life with the benefit of a college degree, what's the next best thing? to be able to get steady work that pays well so you can live comfortably. Okay? I won't go through all the detail here, but in fact, these young white guys, they were advantaged in every respect that we looked at. They were more likely to be employed full-time rather than part-time. When they were out of work, their unemployment spells were shorter duration, and they earned more on every occasion. At age 22, when we asked everybody how they found their first job, or how they found their current job, I'm sorry, here's what we heard. Now, these don't sum to 100 because you could say more than one thing, right? But there's a pattern here. The working class, white men of working class background, much more often said that they found their jobs through family and friends than African Americans. African Americans, much more likely to say they found their jobs on their own. Okay? On your own is not a particularly good place to be if you're young and black and living in a high poverty neighborhood in a city that's bereft, in a neighborhood that's bereft of good job employment opportunities, to be on your own. Now, we know, because we read the literature, this is not anything that we saw at our own research, but it helps to fill out the picture. There are surveys of employers in the non-college labor market, and they tell you, these prospective employers, that they often are reluctant to hire young black men because they are distrustful of them. They think these guys are going to be troublemakers, they're going to be unreliable, they're going to steal from them. They don't want to go anywhere near these guys. They tell you that, which is amazing. You'd think they'd know better, but they tell you that. Also, we know from these same surveys of employers, they're much more likely to ask African American job candidates about a criminal justice record than they ask white candidates. Okay? That's in the broader literature. What we know by looking at the experiences of our young men is that being a high school dropout and having a criminal justice record is much less of an impediment to the employability of white guys than they are to the employability of African American guys. These white guys are not saints. Anything but it. Now, lots of young people stumble upon along the way, right? And middle class parents worry about this just like poor parents do. These white guys actually had the lowest levels of completed schooling on average than any of the other groups we're looking at. Now, in small differences, it's like 11.4 years on average versus 11.6. So none of them, they were all less than high school. If you look at the African American men, African American women, white women, low working class background. The white guys were not getting on in life on the advantage of distinguished academic performance, right? They also had, let me step back and say this differently. Along the way, we asked about problem behaviors. We developed a problem behavior profile. So we asked about drug use, marijuana use, and heavy drug use. We asked about binge drinking. We asked about chewing tobacco. We asked about smoking. But the considerations that are most relevant here, marijuana use, heavy drug use, binge drinking. The group with the highest self-reported rates of all three of those things, they're in this room. White men of middle-class background. Okay? Now, you all, if you're doing any of that stuff, shame on you, but it's not likely to destroy your life. Yeah? Because you can be sheltered from the consequences, right? School will cushion it, or your parents can help cushion the outcome. White men of middle-class background, highest self-reported rates of binge drinking, marijuana use, and heavy drug use. Second highest rates of all three of those things, white men of working class background. White men of working class background. These guys are not saints, but when they take a misstep, it is not fundamentally transformative of their lives. They can get on with their lives and get beyond it because they have people that will vouch for them. You know? They've got people that will look out for them. They've got people who can help open doors. African American men don't have that. I think I'm going to wind down here. I don't know how I'm doing time-wise. It's close to. Anyway, let me just share this last slide with you, and then we can open it up for comment and discussion. Contrasting experiences of Chip and Aaron. So Chip is white, and when he finished high school, he started down the college path, but he decided it wasn't for him. He actually liked the idea of physical labor like his dad did. So he stopped, he withdrew from school, and then he got a job in a trucking company. And it was a trucking company where he had a part-time job during high school because it's where his father worked. An open door, okay? And Chip spent his whole adult life working in that trucking company. When we talked to him as a young adult, he had moved up into a supervisory capacity. And it was a good thing that he did because he had back problems and he couldn't do the heavy lifting that involved in making those deliveries. But here's a young man who carved out a very rewarding and successful career in the blue-collar economy without the benefit of a college degree. But he had an opening. His dad got him that job initially. Now, Aaron, very different experience. And Aaron, if you can read the narrative, his life was challenged in a whole host of ways, so I don't want to overplay it and say, well, there's one and only one thing that made the difference. Aaron doesn't think there's one and only one thing that made the difference. But the description is, well, it'll tear at your heart. His biological father was an alcoholic drug abuser, was in prison. His uncle, who raised him, was killed driving his cab. Tragic loss. Aaron was thrown out of school because he brought a butcher knife to school one time. And he claims it was for self-defense, but it doesn't matter. He got put out. He had lots of run-ins with the law, in and out of jail, himself, also bouts of alcoholism. The bottom line is that when we talked to Aaron as a young adult, he was working in Baltimore's old industrial economy also, but as a construction laborer at $10 an hour. No. Construction laborer at $10 an hour. Very different life experiences without the benefit of a college degree. Okay? And when we asked Aaron, what happened? You had a loving mother who tried to do everything she could to keep you on the right path. What he told us was nothing she could have did would have stopped me from being the person that I am, because I'm not just a product of her, I'm a product of my environment too. And she was not the only influence in my life. So these two success narratives really come down, and this is the kind of our interpretive overlay of it. It really comes down to parents helping their children using the means that are available to them. Parents helping their children using the means that are available to them. Middle-class parents know how to help their children get ready for school and to achieve success at school. So the first success narrative is a story about middle-class family privilege. The second success narrative, which is an account of employment opportunities outside the college labor market, is an account of working-class families, white working-class families, doing what they can do to help their children get launched, and it revolves around social network advantages. Being able to open doors that then provide opportunities for steady work that pays well so you can live more comfortably in the blue-collar community. Parents helping their kids. We don't deal in evil doers. You can't fault a parent for wanting to help his or her child. I can't, right? But where there are families that don't have those opportunities, and we feel it's important for more of Baltimore's young people and more people throughout all America to have those opportunities, then somebody has to step in and do something to help make a difference in their lives. And that's where public policy and public interventions come into play. Okay? Now let me come full circle. Freddie Gray. Okay? And as I said, we didn't write this book around Freddie Gray, but when Freddie Gray happened and I went back and I revisited what we had seen and what I think we learned, I thought, my goodness, yes. Plan A, move up in life by doing well at school. Plan B, get a good job in the non-college labor market. What we see here is that very few low-income children in Baltimore are getting ahead in life on the basis of Plan A. Okay? They're not getting college degrees. 4%, 5.5%, it's just not happening for them. Okay? Plan B, find good paying, steady work in the blue-collar economy. Not very many poor African-American children are able to get ahead in life that way. Okay? Very sobering reality. If Plan A is not working for you and Plan B is not working for you, what's our Plan C? We don't have a Plan C for these young people. Yeah? They're not stupid. They can look around and see what's happening, and they can relate the larger trends to their personal circumstances. Okay? So here we are in Baltimore, a city. I love Baltimore. I'll be there for the rest of my life. But it is a city that faces challenges, and the challenges run deep. There's a long history of police-community tensions. Around the time of Freddie Gray, months prior, every time you turn around in the media, there was an account of some young African-American, typically a young African-American guy, losing his life at the hands of police. It was Ferguson, it was here, it was all throughout the country. Now, I don't want to pass judgment on any of those incidents. They're all complicated and they're challenging, and they all have their own narratives associated with them. But what you see is a pattern. And then when something like that happens locally, right around the corner, you have a tinderbox. It's just waiting to explode. And I think that's what we saw on the west side of Baltimore back then a year ago. No, Plan A is not working in terms of prospects for upward mobility. Plan B is not working. Where am I going to go now? There's not a lot of love for me and for people like me, and look what's happening. And so, sadly, I think if we can't collectively figure out how to change the narrative, then we're just waiting for the next incident to happen. Because unless the fundamentals change, the result is probably going to be the same. It may be years, it may be many years, it may be a different part of the country, but I think we're just looking at more problems ahead unless we can do something about this. To create greater opportunities in a more meaningful way for more of America's young people, disadvantaged young people. So let me stop at that and welcome discussions or comment. Thank you.
Do you want to call on people, or do you want me to?
You can go ahead. And then I just have to sit back and relax. What? Did I run on?
Mr. Alexander, it'd be very glad to hear your questions or comments. When Billy Lewis, could you stand up and speak as loudly as you can and pretend that this is a room where those of us in front are very easily nervous, but I can tell you that it's very hard for people in the audience to hear what it is. We very much want that discussion to take place. So, who would like to start?
Over there, to the left. There.
Yeah, why not?
Thanks, Karl.
Sure, thank you.
I have a question about the women here tonight. So, curious about, given that the highly skilled trades are some of the most gender segregated, durably gender segregated, and that seems to be the opportunity for some of the lower class workers. What happens?
Well, I don't have a slide here. It's not a pretty picture. So in the book, we've got this great big table that gives everybody where they were at age 28. And it turns out that the young woman who started life in working class, in lower income families, were substantially concentrated in what used to be called the pink collar sectors of the economy, low wage, low skill, clerical and retail trades. So they were not doing particularly well financially or in terms of employment prospects in terms of their own labor. But there's an interesting story that we develop in that the white women were much better off financially as young adults because they were more likely to be married or in a cohabiting relationship with a white guy that had a decent job. So more of the young African American women were on their own and experienced what's referred to as the feminization of poverty. That is, often, most of them were single parents and struggling to get by. The rates of teen parenthood, African American and white, were very similar for these women, but the white women were more likely to be in what we call a family union, either married or in a cohabiting relationship. And so Isabel Sawhill, we've got a quote from her who observed that there are, she's a very eminent labor economist from the Brookings Institute. So she said, for young women, there are two ways to get ahead in life. One is by deploying your own labor. The other is by marrying well. And today we would say partnering well. So we see very, very dramatic differences across racial lines in terms of the financial prospects of these young women, not because the white women are doing better themselves In the world of work, they're not. They're not doing that. But because they're the beneficiaries of a second earner in the household or a first earner who's doing well financially. Yeah. Anyway, so I can't. It's in the book. didn't have the time to go through. That's a complicated story, but thank you for asking because it's an important part of it. Yeah. I'm all tethered up here.
Did your study attempt to identify a pure neighborhood or pure school effects rather than saying they were all family effects?
I don't believe in pure neighborhood and pure school effects, so I can't honestly say we tried to identify them. So what we were able to do is describe the constellation of characteristics of family, neighborhood, and school that tended to be aligned across such that the poor kids were on the short side of all those, and the not so poor kids were on the positive side of the characteristics of those three settings. So the thing about it is the Venn diagram, overlapping spheres of influence imagery, if the overlap is severe, and it tends to be severe in the experiences of these young people, it's very difficult to tease out pure effects of family, neighborhood, and school because they're so tightly bundled. I actually think, so as an analytic exercise, sociologists and I guess other social scientists try to do that all the time. I hope this doesn't get me in trouble, but I think the results of those exercises are often somewhat fictional because they posit a world that doesn't exist. And the reality of the world, the world that does exist doesn't have these three settings as separate silos in young people's lives, but they come together as a mosaic of experience. And so to try to kind of separate them in an analytic sense actually does violence to their lived experience. Which is not to say you wouldn't like to try to do it, but I think it's not an easy thing to do. Yes?
So you're saying that the randomized experiments that researchers do to try to find pure effects are not indicative of society because that's not how society is?
No, I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying ours is an observational study of young people growing up in a particular place and at a particular point in time. And all those things get jumbled together. Now, randomized studies do have the potential to do a separation in a way that the real world does not. And I believe in that work. My colleagues at Hopkins, Stephanie DeLuca and others, have been very prominent in doing research on the MTO experience, moving to opportunities, and the counterpart. So. And I'm trying to do something now. We had some discussions about this earlier. And I do believe this. If you can reduce the degree of overlap, you have the potential for creating the space to make some fundamental change. Okay? And I'm trying to launch an initiative back in Baltimore that would help support schools that are committed to diversity in their enrollment, to reduce the overlap of school, neighborhood, and family. And so if you can get more poor kids outside of the trap of concentrated poverty at their schools, you have the potential to move them ahead. So I do believe that. What I'm saying is in the lived experience of young people like this, it's very hard to rigorously achieve that kind of separation and to think that you've captured their lived experience. That's what I'm saying. Yes?
Do you come up with positions to solve the achievement stuff?
I'm sorry, say it again?
Do you come up with positions to solve the achievement stuff?
That's a probing question. Do I come up with solutions to solve the achievement gap? I think I understand where the achievement gap comes from. So the lecture I'll be giving tomorrow on the summer learning loss, it's really quite striking. Poor children if you look at their achievement, we have achievement test scores, and we monitor how their academic development as reflected in achievement test scores track over the time. If you look at their achievement gains of poor kids fall to spring during the school year, they're gaining at parity with the middle class kids. That is, they're building up their skills during the school year at a similar rate or pace as the non-poor kids, middle class kids. Where children fall behind, our children at least, and you see this in some of the other literature as well, is over the summer months, where poor kids are not making progress academically in developing the kinds of skills that show up in standardized achievement tests. Whereas children of middle class background, they continue to build up that skill set through the experiences their parents, their families are able to provide over the summer. And so when they start the next school year, they actually are farther ahead, the middle class kids, than they had been at the end of the previous school year. So what that tells me is that the achievement gap over time, which explodes in our research, you won't have to come to DeBar's lecture. Poor kids on average start out a half grade level behind in the fall of first grade in reading comprehension. That's a fundamental building block of everything that follows. If you can't read tolerably well, you're not going anyplace. Poor kids start out a half grade level behind in reading comprehension on the California Achievement Test. It's a nationally normed standardized test. Half grade level behind in the fall of first grade. That's the very first testing occasion for them. At the end of fifth grade, which is the elementary year grade span in Baltimore, first through fifth grade, the average poor child is 3 grade equivalents behind. So that's the exploding achievement gap. It goes from a half a grade equivalent to 3 grade equivalents. That means a poor child, typical poor child, not every poor child, but a typical poor child, at the end of fifth grade might be reading at a 3rd grade level, maybe a 4th grade level. Whereas the typical middle class child would be reading at a 6th grade level, already ahead of grade level. That's a very big deficit to close at that point in their schooling. That's not a good place to be at the verge of moving on to middle grades. What we find is that all of the increase in the achievement gap over those 5 years of elementary school, all of the increase in the achievement gap traces to differential summer learning. These poor kids are falling behind when they're cut off from the educational resources and the enrichment experiences that are available to them in school, because their parents don't have the means to help move them ahead and support their learning in the kinds of academic skills that show up on standardized achievement tests. So, do I know how to close the achievement gap? I think I have an understanding of what would make an immense contribution is to strengthen the summer learning opportunities available to poor kids. And not just summer learning opportunities, but also the preschool learning opportunities and also after-school learning opportunities. There's a healthy interest nowadays in what's referred to as out-of-school time learning, which is everything other than the school hours, right? So poor kids don't have the opportunities to move ahead during the out-of-school hours. And if we want to help them move ahead, then we need to strengthen the learning opportunities that are available to them that their parents are not able to provide. One of the important takeaway points from this literature that compares school year learning to summer learning is that poor kids are capable learners because they do move ahead during the school year. They're falling behind when they don't have access to the kinds of resources that help them realize their academic potential. So, yeah, I think I know how to close the achievement gap. But we don't do it. We don't have the political will. We're not willing to commit the resources. We don't do it. We know a lot about how to improve the academic prospects of poor kids, of all kids. We know a lot, but we don't do it. So do it. I'm old in the tooth. I'm not going to be around to take care of it, but you all can. So do it. Yes.
I was wondering if you could say a bit more about what you think explains this difference in the patterns of employment among the working class poor African Americans and white men. So the suggestion you made was that it could be traced the difference in who was holding what kind of job when Baltimore's economy was booming in the industrial sector. But I was wondering why that wasn't also reflected in different economic status of the families going in. And if they're all
low-income families going in. Why? So
Yeah, I got
You
you.
would have thought if that was the explanation, that would be reflected in the white families being of higher income in the first place, rather than that being an explanation of.
Well, they are, though. These white families are better off financially. Yeah.
I see. So
Yeah.
they're
But they're not, they're still, remember there's the blue collar elite? I mean, that's a meaning, that's a concept that's rich with import as far as I'm concerned, because they were better off, decidedly better off, but still blue collar. So now if you look, the middle class, I wish I had that great big table that's got everybody in it, but the children of middle class who grew up in middle class families were much better off financially than all the blue collar folks. They were we classify them according to the gross census classification from executive managers down to laborers. And the middle class kids who went to college, they're occupying the top tier of employment. But the white blue collar workers were in the middle tier, and the African American blue collar workers were in the lower tier. So there are advantages, there are real differences there, but they're they're concentrated in the non-college segment of the labor market. But to say that you have better employment opportunities for steady work that pays well doesn't necessarily mean you're moving up the spectrum. So this is all playing out within what I think of as the blue collar sector of the economy. But there are real advantages. So I don't mean to say that I had a slide that quotes Bonilla Silva about, oh, there it is. I didn't know that was up there. The racial practices and mechanisms that have kept blacks subordinated changed from overtly and eminently racist to covertly and indirectly racist. So there's a lot of insight in that. So back in the day when African Americans were excluded from the labor unions, they just couldn't be in the labor union. So nowadays you have all the formal doors are open. You have equal employment opportunity laws, you have fair housing laws, and so forth. But that doesn't mean the reality on the ground reflects all that. And so what Bonilla Silva's point is that, in a sense, what goes around comes around. The same dynamics are still observable out there, even though the mechanics of how those advantages are perpetuated have changed over the decades since. And you see a lot of that. So, white working class privilege now. Connections and family are important among the urban disadvantaged, but more usefully so among whites and African Americans. There's this, what's Smith's first name? And she's a Berkeley sociologist who published a book called Susan Smith, thank you, Lone Pursuit. And what she finds is that when African Americans are much less willing to recommend a family member or a neighbor for a job, when there could be social capital that would help open doors, they're much more reluctant to do that because of the fear of repercussions that would come their way if the hire went bad. So they're not willing to take the chance, recommend somebody for a job, and then it comes back on them. Apparently the white working class don't have the same kinds of concerns about repercussions that hit home for them. Diva Pager and others, the mark of a criminal record weighs more heavily. The stigma of a criminal justice record weighs more heavily on African Americans than on whites. We see that in the experiences of our young people. Negative discrimination. There's a literature about reluctance to hire based on neighborhood, but neighborhood's a code word for race in places like Baltimore. And then job referrals. Hiring based on who you know and who knows you. And so these are all social dynamics that together kind of tend to move the needle in the direction of favoring whites in these circumstances and imposing barriers upon African Americans. There's also a whole story about neighborhood instability that comes into play too, in terms of, I mentioned social cohesion. The low-income African American neighborhoods in Baltimore are much more distressed than are the low-income white neighborhoods in Baltimore. And so being distressed, they're not as strong of as a as a launching pad for opportunities later. What we see reporting arrest records, police for property and violent crimes, and police statistics. Poor African American neighborhoods in Baltimore have much higher rates of criminal victimization, and so that takes its toll in terms of being able to use your neighbors as assets and to provide opportunities. They're also much less cohesive, those neighborhoods, as a result of a long history of disadvantage. No, you're not impressed that slide was there. Yes?
I have a question about the methods. There seems to be a lot of challenges in interviewing, especially young children. I was wondering if you had any difficulties in the interviewing process, and if so, how do you address them?
Oh, it's just easy as can be. Actually, well, thank you for asking that. Now, if we had another hour, I could tell you the story of how this project actually got done. But in point of fact, back in the day when we launched this, there was a lot of skepticism that you could get useful information from 6-year-olds. You know? So there's a sense in which what we did here was a demonstration project to establish the viability of doing this kind of study. So some of you in the room may be familiar with the Early Childhood Longitudinal Survey, which is a national study of kindergartners that National Center for Education Statistics launched back in 1997. Doris and I were on the technical advisory team for ECHLS, the ECHLS 97. And I do think that the fact that we were able to do this, and by all accounts to do it well, helped encourage others to think that you could do research on early childhood development with a focus on the social context and get useful information from little kids. We had to work hard to make our questions accessible and appropriate for kids that age. And so, we did things like, we wanted to explore their sense of the job imagery, what you want to be when you grow up. But we didn't want to just ask, what do you want to be when you grow up? So we had these little cartoon type androgynous pictures worked up. Would you rather be a taxi driver or a nurse? And we showed pictures of what they were, and they could point to the one that they wanted, that kind of thing. We had actually a very nice little framework for how we distinguished occupations by their gender type and by their socioeconomic level that way. We brought in mock-ups of report cards. We asked them what they expected they were going to get on their very first report card before they ever had their first report card. So we had a little mock-up of a report card, and we had to explain what it was all about, and then we asked the questions, and we recorded their answers. So having done all that, so how far back do I want to go? Our very first pupil interview, the one that we did at the fall of 1982, we field tested in my daughter's preschool program the year before to make sure that it was accessible to little kids. And that was an important thing, important part of the project. But once we had it all worked out, it all went very smoothly. We encountered very few difficulties in implementing the plan. And we stayed with it over all those years. So the interesting thing is that how could we have achieved such great success? 25 years, 80% of the original group, very little attrition. Along the way, we did have some who told us to go away. We were just too much of a bother, but not a large number. And I think a couple considerations came into play. One is that for the kids at least, most of them couldn't remember a time when we weren't in their lives. We were in the early years we talked to them twice annually, fall and spring, and we did that through the middle grades. And then when they got to high school, we went to spring-only interviews. But we were there. We just kept coming back, and we respected them. We sent them birthday cards, which was a nice gesture. I think that helped. They seemed to like getting birthday cards, and what we came to realize along the way was that many of them appreciated the fact that we were interested in hearing their stories, when often they didn't have anybody that they could turn to who was interested in hearing their stories, which is kind of a sad reason for being successful. But I think it worked to our advantage because it was genuine. We really cared about these people, established relationships with them. Yeah, Dick.
you mentioned different political choices in education. You also, at the beginning and the end, connected your work with the demonstrations around the killing of Freddie Gray, which were part of a larger social movement in the United States. That made me wonder what happened when the people in your study taught politics. What did they say that suggested how they might connect with a social movement? And you know, the young person in the poster holds a sign saying the whole damn system is guilty as hell. That's quite a social statement. What are their hopes or?
Well,
social change.
That's a great question. I wish I could answer it with any degree of authority, but we didn't go there in our questioning. That's not what we were about, so I don't really have much to say. But I would say that the young people who took to the streets in Baltimore in the wake of Freddie Gray were not our young people. Ours were a decade older. You know, those were in the main late adolescent in the early 20s. Ours were in their 30s already and had moved on with their lives and established kind of some stability. So I don't think many of our people were out in the streets. And that was for a different generation. Some of them were doing fine, we know, because we kept up with them. Not all. Yeah. But I can't really speak to what they would have to say. If we asked them to reflect on what was happening in Baltimore at the time a year ago, I have no idea, because we didn't go there. Wish we had. Sounds like another good study. Well, I think there's another hand over there.
So I don't think we looked at any differences by race for the middle class segment, but I was just curious if you think that the best policy for solving these gaps is through education, and we already have policy that's supposed to address employer discrimination.
Right.
Do you think that that issue will still persist even if they're getting better education, that they're going to be still facing the same discrimination from employers and still facing challenges in that regard?
So let me say a couple things. One is that in the book, we actually have three strata. There's the working class kids growing up, that's about half the panel. There's a middle group, that's about a fourth of the panel, and then what we characterize as the middle class kids, it's the other fourth. Throughout most of the book, we suppress the middle group because there's such a dramatic orderliness to it. You know, we're mainly interested in comparisons across the extremes, but if you look at the middle group, they're squarely in the middle. That's what hierarchy is about. That's what stratification is about. There's a layering, and it's all very orderly, distressingly so. So if I had slides up here that showed you where the middle group stood in relation to the others, they'd be in the middle. They'd be in the middle, almost without exception. It's really quite extraordinary. So if we could improve the educational prospects for more poor kids, I have to think that would be a great accomplishment and that we would see some real benefits follow, which doesn't necessarily mean it would open doors to where we'd have everyone at parity as adults in terms of earnings or in terms of job placements, but we would be registering progress, and progress is important. And then if that leaves other obstacles that need to be addressed, like the informal practices that still throw up interference for people of color, then you take those on. But at least you've achieved some clarity as to what needs to be worked on. So I'm still an education reform person. I think we ought to do better than we have been doing, and I think we understand what ought to be done, and it's a matter of making it happen. And that's what. At the back, yes?
Were there black members on your interview team, and whether the answer is yes or no, do you think that is significant?
We did have African American interviewers along the way. They were graduate students mainly, but sometimes we hired part-time workers or full-time workers to assist on interviewing, and we had interviewers of color. We actually recorded along the way whether there was a match between the racial makeup of the interviewer and of the subject. And in the early years, we kind of looked to see if we could see any discernible pattern, and we couldn't, so we stopped worrying about it. Now, maybe we should have worried about it, I don't know. But again, I think if to the extent that that's something we ought to be mindful of. I absolutely think that it's conceivable that that could be there could be distorting influences that revolve around these the dynamics of race and class and gender. But I think the fact that we were so trusted by these people probably helped. Now, I can't demonstrate that other than to say I believe it. Because, as I said, we were with them from when they were cute and cuddly first graders. And we stayed with it over the long haul. So I think there was an element of trust. I actually think the reason I mentioned the problem behavior profiles where we asked them about all this stuff, you would think they'd be very self-conscious in describing, that they were doing drugs and they were doing. It was like an open book, that there didn't seem to be any hesitance in just in confiding in us. But we were mindful of the issue that you raised in the early phases of the project, and we didn't see that there was anything, any distortions to the responses we were getting that revolved around the match or mismatch of the interviewer and the subject. One more question?
So along those lines, I'm wondering if over time you asked the interviewees about race itself to see if you could track the evolution of prejudicial views on the part of white interviewees, or?
No, sadly we did not. No. I wish. Oh well, there's all kinds of things I wish we could have done in retrospect. No, I can't speak to that. And it would have been great had we. If we had known where this project was going to take us at the outset, we would have approached it differently. But we didn't pose those kinds of questions.
This fall, Ethics in Public Life will bring eminent social scientists to Cornell to talk about deep issues raised in and by the election, in the presidential election, questions such as the significance of immigration, the significance of change in America's role in the world, by the election, such as what the hell is going on? Stay tuned then. Stay tuned for the election, of course, but reserve some time for us. And now let's thank Karl Alexander for a wonderful conclusion.